Ceará Global 2020, the future in 360 degrees, an event that's totally online, innovative, and done with co-creation. Brought to you by Chamber of Commerce and Foreign Investments, and Brazil and Portugal Chamber of Commerce in Ceará, sponsorship from AECIP, AECIP, APSV Advogados, the House of Representatives of the State of Ceará, BF Fortship, Banco do Nordeste, Bugaboo Studio, Café Santa Clara, FIEC, Quer, Sebrae Ceará, SP Combustíveis, and Fortaleza University Unifor Edson Queiroz Foundation, co-sponsorship from Secretariat of Tourism of the State of Ceará. Support from Casa Azul Ventures, Elephant Co-working, the Federation of Chambers of Commerce, Brazil Africa Institute, JUSEC, Mango Ventures, France Observatory, Trends CE, Vetor Brands and Patents, Wins for Future, institutional support from Apex Brazil, FEComércio Ceará, and PECEM, technological support from Mob Telecom, iProject TI, Tape, organized by Prática Eventos and Move On. Media partner, Grupo O Povo, Ceará Global 2020. We're on our second day of activities with a full program and with different topics. Our panel now talks about the zone for export processing. Here in Ceará, we're responsible for many imports of the state. And our mediator, Mônica Luiz, president of the Foreign Trade Chamber of Commerce, and our panelists, Mário Lima, president from ZPE Ceará, Ricardo Parente, president from the Association of Companies from the PECEM Complex, and Leonardo Rabelo Santana, executive secretary from the National Council of ZPE, talking to us directly from Brasília. So have a great panel, Ceará Global 2020. Hello, I'm Mônica Luiz, president of the Sectorial Chamber from AECIP. It's a great pleasure to coordinate this panel talking about the ZPE. And so for many years, Brazil has been studying and analyzing instruments and tools that could attract foreign investments for our development. And studies and discussions to improve this competitive advantage of companies made the Brazilian government create these export processing zones. And so this was created more than 25 years ago. And there was a whole history of rolling out, different from the characteristics of each region. And of course, the first ZPE installed in the country was inaugurated in PECEM in 2003. So after overcoming these initial hurdles, today we have a scenario that's in expansion, even as the economy is coming back on track. So we'd like to know how the ZPEs can help Brazil to grow. And so to talk about this topic, we have our guests with us on this panel, the representative of the National Council of the ZPEs, Leonardo Rabelo Santana. I'd like to thank you for being here with us virtually. The president of the ZPE in Ceará, Mário Lima. And also, I'd like to thank you for being here with us. And our friend and president from AECIP, the Association of Companies from the Port Complex in PECEM, Ricardo Parente. And also thank you very much for supporting Ceará Global and being together with us in this panel. So this panel is for approximately 50 minutes, and we have three general pillars. First, the export processing zones, the importance for regional development, and the future of ZPE in Ceará and in Brazil as a whole.
Leonardo Rabelo,
In a nutshell, for the people that are listening to us, what exactly is an export processing zone, a ZPE? What characteristics do we need to know about these different areas?
Olá, Mônica. Olá, pessoal.
Hello, Monica. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the participation.
De uma forma bem didática,
in a nutshell,
nós podemos pensar
we can think of a ZPE as a geographic area where you have different business rules, if you will. These business rules are different as a way to attract investments and to encourage this activity. That could be, in the case of Brazil, through exports, could be through different sectors or industries that are strategic. International experience is quite varied. I mean, you have different export objectives, as I've mentioned before. Innovation, which has appeared a lot lately in the international scenario. Research and development, and the nomenclature of these areas is different. We have the ZPEs. In other countries, you have free trade zones. Spanish-speaking countries use Zona Franca. We also have, in Brazil, in the case of Manaus. And so it's different experiences within this context of an area that's limited with different business rules. President Mário Lima, the ZPE in Ceará is part of a world network, a global network of ZPEs. What are the similarities and the differences of these ZPEs in Brazil and the ZPEs that exist in other countries? Well, the taxation system. Other countries use IVA or EVA or VAT, value-added tax, and we have a whole set of taxes that we have in our country, that we have in Brazil, and so this is a very bureaucratic system. It seems that only 2 countries in the world adopt the Brazilian system for taxation, and so this is a factor that greatly influences the development of these free trade zones, or ZPEs. But this generates a certain equilibrium, a certain balance. We have some cases of success in Ceará, but the issue that I see, the greatest difference, is taxation. Right. Ricardo Parente, you saw the ZPE in Pecém being born. I mean, you participated in this whole process. And what was decisive for Ceará to, be on the forefront? Hello, Mônica. Hello, everyone. Mário and Leonardo. So I think the most important point that I consider is the dialogue between the parties involved, the government, the private sector, and civil society as a whole. I mean, the state of Ceará, I think, is really an outlier. And through dialogue with the federal government and with investors, we were able to establish a ZPE in Ceará, an attraction of major players, both domestic and international players, and the steel mill especially. And so the main point, I would say, is dialogue. The federal government, through the Council of ZPEs, providing all the support needed. The Federal Tax Service, And what's very important in ZPE is customs. And I'd like to congratulate the tax authority that participated so that we could really meet our objectives. The state of Ceará, with all the support, all the dialogue, and investors, national investors and a Korean investor, and civil society represented by federations, FEComércio, FIEC, and all. And so we're all on the same table with the same purpose, trying to be very objective. President Maia Lima, what kind of companies can install themselves in a ZPE that today can be part of the ZPE, for example? Well, it's a policy from the government to promote exports. So really, there's no limits in those that can be in a ZPE. But today, there is an attempt to improve our regulatory framework. And perhaps Leonardo can talk more about this. The efforts of ZPE in Brazil began in the Sarney government in 1988. And at the same time, Korea had theirs and China, and we just stopped many of these years. These countries developed a lot in their international trade and their exports, special economic zones. And this made our country having only one ZPE in operation. That's very difficult for us, when we compare ourselves to Colombia, that has many ZPEs in operation. There they have an association that discusses this in an effective way. They have stronger dialogue with the federal government in Colombia, because they have many of these free trade zones. So this is something that tells us that we need partners. We need more partners to talk about this. I mean, we have to create and develop and provide good services. In the case of Ceará, is to guarantee more investments, such as the CSP steel mill. But, with this new regulatory framework, will allow for this to really take off. Despite all of the efforts from the federal government, all of the efforts from our politicians in Brasilia, and the new regulatory framework. And then we had the pandemic, which made us sort of stuck and makes things even more difficult. But I see that we need to have greater coordination so we can create other ZPs. As the president of the ZP in Ceará, I would like to talk to the ZPs in Rio de Janeiro, Rio Grande do Norte, Piauí, and to discuss these different problems. Dr. Ricardo Parente knows this very well, for the development of the system as a whole. I mean, this is something that we have to do, and we need to do the best that we can so that the projects that are ours can grow more and more. And furthermore, we have to encourage new initiatives. We need to forget about Brazil that just exports commodities. This is back from colonial times. Until today, we haven't been able to export many of our products because there is an anti-export culture in Brazil. Ricardo Parente, the ZPE is responsible for around 50% of exports of Ceará, and also quite an expressive volume of imports, right? So what's the impact? What's the impact of this in the state's economy? Well, it's significant. I mean, the state of Ceará has today major industry, major companies that are quite well represented in Brazil and Latin America, like M. Dias Branco, J. Macedo, Apivida, and so there are many segments of the market. And we have a steel mill, investments of $5.1 billion, like Mario mentioned, the second largest private investment in the last 20 years in Brazil, where, the units are huge. We're talking about 3 million tons in production, basically 100% almost that's exported. And so the impact, economic impact of the steel mill in the state of Ceará is gigantic. Even talking about local acquisitions, a year in the state of Ceará, equipment and material and services, we're talking about millions of reais. And we have a project to develop more and more suppliers in Ceará for equipment, materials, and services, because the complex, besides the steel mill, there's a potential of 4 billion reais. So many opportunities. The impact is huge. It's significant. We represent today, in values of exports, 55%. Leonardo, what is your assessment of the ZPE and PECEM in the Brazilian context? I mean, we have other states, other ZPEs. So what is their reality of these ZPEs in comparison to Ceará? Are they also relevant for regional development? Well, today we have 16 ZPEs that are authorized in the country. The ZPE in Ceará, like Dr. Mario mentioned, is the only one that is fully operational. The other ZPEs are in different stages of implementation. Some already have begun the process of construction. Others not yet, and so most are still quite preliminary. The ZPE in Piauí, which is the final phase of construction, we have construction underway, at least. Of course, we can't forget about the pandemic, and this construction is suffering the impacts. There's some delays, but we have a lot of construction underway in Mato Grosso, to continue with construction in Mato Grosso do Sul, and a ZPE in Rio de Janeiro that was created. That's where they're selecting the private administration company. Also, they have a privileged location in the port of Açu in João da Barra in Rio de Janeiro. So to work with the ZPE, you need to bear in mind that each project has a specific reality. I mean, we have projects that were created a long time ago, and even so are feasible, and some projects that don't have all of the necessary conditions. What we have, in fact, a structural challenge is the legal framework. Mario mentioned this already. Our legal framework is a snapshot of what we used to do back in the 80s still. So if we go from the 80s until now, what has changed in the world economic history and in Brazil? We have within this context the challenge of encouraging new ZPs together with international experience. When you see growing participation of the private sector, industrial projects, and the development of developments. And this is quite relevant because it brings private investments as a driver for these new projects. And these really are the challenges that we have today. I believe there are many discussions today about changing the legal framework, and that can contribute significantly to improve the Brazilian experience. Mario Lima, what type of industry today the ZPE in Ceará is trying to attract? I mean, who are we negotiating with? Who are we trying to bring here? Well, we're in the 7th year of operations with the steel mill. That was really the first experience, and it was based on this that we obtained more experience. And like I said, with no problems, zero problems with the tax authority. And this was very important for us. We see today ZPE in Ceará as something very positive. And so what we think is to multiply these districts. We have an industrial district that's in operation for 6.5 years now, and a second one that will operate February, March of next year. Now, when this district will be up and running, the strategy is first to seek local exporters or potential local exporters. This is difficult for us because our state exports very little, So that's a reality. I mean, you count on the fingers of one hand the companies in Ceará that are truly exporting. So we need to encourage that. I say this because, first, the local culture needs to absorb this culture of a ZPE. And then, the market niches for ZPEs are interesting. First is granite. The main one is granite. The state of Ceará is a very rich state because of the variety of ornamental rocks. And so that's number one, the granite industry. If I say that we have 5 granite companies in negotiations with us, I'm being somewhat humble, We have very good information from the granite sector for the next few months. We have another vocation, which is footwear, and leather footwear, more specifically. We've consolidated in the last few years, and we have very interesting space for exports for footwear. And this culture that we've gained from Rio Grande do Sul. Dr. Ricardo Parente also mentioned the food industry. So when we work in a ZPE, for example, with wheat and the production of products made from wheat, and that could be in the ZPE with cross benefits of a company exporting to another, and a very interesting result. And agribusiness, cashew nuts, that's another very important point in a ZPE, and also the textile industry. that gives us a lot of hope is the textile industry in Ceará. Our cotton and fiber being produced now is being produced exceptional quality. And so we multiply the production of irrigated cotton. And that can become apparel, and all of this can be exported. So these different sectors, these industries are instrumental, but also we can't forget high-tech industry. The state of Ceará has the conditions, interesting conditions, for pharmaceutical industry, for example, airspace. And so these are market niches that we're trying to involve ourselves. And why are people seeking us? Well, we have an expansion under construction. Ceará today does not sell greenfield. We're selling reality. We're selling infrastructure. You just have to go and see what's going on. So this infrastructure is excellent. Even with the difficulties of the pandemic, all of the problems that we have, but we have some great news for 2021 at the ZPE in Pecém. And so the case of CSP, the steel mill, it's really interesting. It's wonderful to see what's been done with the steel mill. And so an example for Northeast, an example for Brazil. We're very proud. Pecém is organizing, is structuring itself. There's an association, AECIP. This association is not alone. It's not just because of one industry. It's from different industries. And like Dr. Ricardo Santana mentioned, many points for discussion. So, in terms of what you asked, I see a very promising future, even in the pandemic. But Pecém today is a niche to generate wealth, to generate technology. Young people who want a better future and a better life for all of us. Yeah. So, Ricardo Parente, we have many of these companies in Pecém's ZPE that are part of AECIP, that are associated to AECIP. So what's the impact of the ZPE in creating jobs and income in Ceará, would you say? Well, actually, in the ZPE, we have the steel mill. We have a service provider and White Martins, where they produce oxygen and nitrogen. And they're also within the perimeter of the ZPE. And so in the pandemic, for example, our production of oxygen, we produce oxygen for steel production. And the market multiplied by 15, and White Martins was able to supply. Only the steel mill generates direct and indirect jobs, 24,000 jobs in the state. For each job in industry, there are 3 on the outside that are generated. This is an indicator from the Ministry of Economy. And so you usually multiply by 3. We have 2,500 employees and around 3,000 that are outsourced. And so today, operating in the company, we have 6,000 employees. For each one that you have inside, there's 3 on the outside. So it's 18,000 on the outside. So total, it's 24,000. Now I'm talking about the complex as a whole that involves ZPE and other companies. Many companies that are associated, 13,000 direct jobs within the complex. And so if you multiply with 3, we're talking about 50,000 jobs, direct and indirect jobs within the complex. And so it's booming, really. It's a huge impact not only of the ZPE, but also the complex as a whole. We were very visionary and very objective. Created the complex. It's within 2 municipalities, Caucaia and São Gonçalo do Amarante, and attracted the steel mill and a refinery as an anchor company. And so the complex today in Pecém, and mainly the port, in building the port, you attract the feasibility of the complex and consider the complex really the crown jewel, if you will. Okay, I have a question for the 3 of you regarding these changes in the rules. I mean, this is underway, right? And so in the last few years, we've seen that the last few years with this experience has shown us that we really need to change some things in the framework. Yeah, as we mentioned, there's a consensus, the need to modernize this regulatory framework. It's a little bit difficult to identify only one of the things that you need to change. And so it's important to bear in mind when we think about the changes in the regulatory framework. There's some specific aspects, but the context today is a very dynamic context because we live the reality of an industrial revolution, Industry 4.0. And so sectors that before we used to see as not very probable become very relevant all of a sudden. I mean, this entire context can change. So I think some of the aspects that we need to bear in mind, first, the evolution of international economy, greater integration, and I think this was mentioned by Ricardo, integration of ZP with the local economy. So when we analyze international experience, you know, the ZPE needs to be integrated to the local economy. So there's a generation of wealth that's less than its true potential. And that's what we don't want. Ceará has a factor that's extremely important, which is logistics. Okay, there is a project for logistics in Pecém that gives us conditions, not only in terms of the ZPE, but the whole complex as a whole, and that makes a major difference. You know, these chains of production that are more and more integrated, and that makes a huge difference. I mean, you create the conditions
realmente se integrar
so that you can integrate in this kind of activity, which is very important. Well, in these changes in regulation in the ZPEs, I mean,
do faturamento, do percentual de faturamento das exportações,
the total revenue from exports, would that be an obstacle for many companies as we wait for these changes to happen? Well, I think it's going to happen. I believe in the tax reforms. The country can no longer wait for tax reforms. Now, today we have a limiting factor, to say that all of the revenue be used for export. So to convince our exporters that are exporting 20-25% of the revenue, they'll have to export 80%. I mean, it's very difficult, So it's important that the commitment be eliminated. We need to eliminate this idea. You need so that all concerns with the Ministry of the Economy to compensate this. So exporters know there are good years and bad years. And so this commitment needs to be eliminated. I mean, we need to find ways so that the system can remain in equilibrium. That's something very important. And also the ZPE, like we're doing, they need to be industrial districts. So companies within the ZPE, they need to be supported by the system as a whole. And that no exports or imports be undermined, be harmed. And so, we, with our experience, the ZPEs in Ceará, everything was developed by people in Ceará that are in their daily operations. And so that gives us total security. And so if there's going to be changes, there are changes that will make things better, to improve, to simplify, and the ZPEs in industrial districts. We cannot be bureaucrats, you know what I mean? We need to think in development. We need to think what the business community needs. That's our role. Ricardo Parente, what you mentioned regarding these necessary changes that can encourage more companies installing themselves in the ZPE. Well, I think we need to evaluate the moment, see the challenges and opportunities that we have ahead of us. A moment of the pandemic brought about a lot of retrocess, in globalization. And so we need to think also opportunities. Everything was concentrated in Asia, and now we need to rethink our concept of globalization. I think ZPE is a great opportunity. It's a great challenge. And so our law that establishes where we need to export 80% minimum and 20% that you can sell in the domestic market. And so we have a bill that modifies this to less, and also already thinking about exports, and it's a moment to accelerate all of this. Mainly rules of the game, like Leonardo mentioned, industrialization, and others also mentioned this. Services and high-tech companies, that's what we need to attract, not only industry, but high-tech services, etc. So, major challenges, but also many opportunities. I think the federal government has already seen that we need to accelerate with all of this. The state of Ceará has supported with the information that I've received, and I think it's an interesting moment. It's a great moment. To help to consolidate. Leonardo Rabelo, an evaluation for the creation of the ZPs according to the economic vocation of each region. Is this still being studied? Well, the analysis of an local economic profile undoubtedly is a determining factor, I would say, when we analyze a ZP. To create a ZP, but it's not an exclusive factor. In the case of Ceará, we have the steel mill project. We know all the struggle that took place with this project, and it was a new element. And so it's a reality for the state of Ceará that does, it's a huge project. The effects are not only in Ceará, there's effects throughout the country. When you stop and think about it, in the whole country, and so Ceará today occupies the second position in national export rank of steel products. This is from a macroeconomic point of view, how we see this every day, And that's local jobs, local economy moving. And so all of this is relevant. Now, usually the council analyzes the local economic profile, but sometimes new projects come up that are taken into account. And so you have these two elements. It's not necessarily exclusively the local profile. President Mário Lima, regarding services, how does that work exactly? Service providers, for exporters, service providers. This was regulated already, or are there restrictions for these companies? Well, services today are part of the end product. So when we talk about exports from the ZPE, there's the product and services associated to it. So it's part of this group. Service providers, through the resolution from the ZPE, has disciplined this issue and allows service companies to come in without tax breaks. But within this project that Dr. Ricardo mentioned, also forecasts the export of services. And so the communication centers, architecture firms, large call centers, software development. All of this is within the framework. And lastly, I think I'm very optimistic. I'm always quite optimistic I really hope this all works well.
A reforma tributária paralela a essa questão da modernização do marco regulatório é fundamental. Estamos vendo vontade do Ministério da Economia de fazer isso. Estamos vendo que existem
And so we see that
condicionantes como se o Brasil não
there are
pode ter
conditions that Brazil never had before.
Então, isso eu vejo com otimismo.
And so I see this in a very optimistic light, and that 2021 will be the year, the right year, to do all of this.
Ricardo, Parente,
within this free trade zone. So ZPE is the way for us to increase Brazilian exports? Well, I don't think only to increase Brazilian exports, but effectively increase the Brazilian economy with private investments. I think the federal government has been investing in infrastructure, health, and education, but private investment in production is extremely important, and ZPE is the way for private investors. Like Mário mentioned, we need to obtain great industry, big companies that already export 20, 30, 40%, and don't go into the ZPE because they minimum 80% exports is mandatory. So this really moves the economy. I mean, it's a multiplying factor. So the impact is for the state, but it's really the whole country that's impacted, because the trade balance, we're the second largest exporters in terms of steel products, and so we're talking about huge industry. And also other types of industry like footwear, where they hire more, there's more jobs, there's significant labor involved. And so exports, are important, but also we need to look at the domestic market, potential that Brazil has in terms of the market. I'd like to highlight, it's just as important, that we built a steel mill. And we always used to think, there's no labor in Ceará. How are you going to do it? And today we have many jobs. And so Ceará is also an outlier in terms of education, in terms of technology, fiber optic cables, where it's all interconnected. So this really promotes digital transformation. And so not only the impact of exports, we have a potential in the domestic market. And, the retrocess of globalization is going to help us to rethink the market. So it's a moment of challenges, but also for opportunities.
Presidente Mário Lima, poderia nos falar pouquinho mais sobre a expansão da ZPE do PC que está em curso?
Anyway, that's my
o governador do Ceará esteve visitando essas obras.
Yeah.
Essa expansão do ZPE
President Mário Lima, could you talk to us a little bit more about the expansion, the ZPE in Pecém that's underway? The governor was visiting recently. Why the ZPE expansion is so important at this moment? First, to meet the needs of demand, a potential demand that we have. For production and exports and diversification.
Estamos aqui para apoiar e fazemos isso com todo orgulho, mas nós temos que diversificar, né? Porque quando se diversifica, você puxa os segmentos de desenvolvimento junto.
So we do this,
a inovação,
but we need to diversify, because when you diversify, you have more development together with research and innovation, universities, development institutes. All of this is interconnected. This is something that creates a hub, a development hub that's quite interesting. And so what we're doing is an area of the state. It's a territory of the state. This is an area of 23 hectares, where half is for a granite hub. Like I mentioned, we have great expectations for the beginning of 2021. And within this area, we've done preliminary studies, the approval of licenses, 240 hectares for expansion. So, this will be done gradually. Like I said, we can't go to the international investment market while we're not ready in our domestic market. We need to improve some of these steps in order to get there. And when we go to the international market, we'll be stronger. We'll have all of our routines. And so ZPE is a primary area. ZPE, we need to have the presence of government authorities, like an airport or a port. We need to have Ministry of Agriculture, Finance Ministry, IBAMA. You produce food, you also need to have the Ministry of Health. All of this within the ZPE. The advantages, clearance will be within the ZPE, which is easier than the port. And a port, with 6,000 clients. In the ZPE, we have 5 or 6 industries. And that means it's an expedited process. It's quick. And export around 2 days. And that's going to facilitate things. And so everything is done in a safer manner. It's simplified. So there are the conditions, let's say. So many advantages within a ZP. The speed, really, that you can process inbound and outbound products. Using the port really moves things quickly. And of course, the airport, modern airport the way it is, with international airlines. So it's very, very interesting and set up supporting the industries within the ZP. Well, we're almost at the end of our panel, and I'd like to ask for each of our guests to give us their closing remarks. Let's start with Ricardo Parente. Yeah, I'd like to thank the organizers of Será Global and yourself, Mônica, as a moderator. I'd like to thank the participation of Leonardo, Santana, Mário Lima, a great colleague. And, my final message for investors, not only international investors, but even national, please come to Será. This is a state that's an outlier, but really off the curve, a serious state, committed, and always trying to do the best that we can. We still have a lot to do, but definitely with ZPE or without ZPE, we're going to advance more and more. So please come to Será. This is the place to be. Now we invite the president of ZPE from PC, Mário Lima, for your closing remarks. Well, I'd like to say that this presentation here in Será Global really encouraged me, and a moment for us to talk about these different points. I'm sure that this will be disseminated and communicated. This is important to have positive energy from the community, from the population, the business community. It's important for them to see, to know all of these elements and to support us. And also, the message from our colleague Ricardo Parente, a man who not only thinks in terms of companies, but he also thinks in the community. Once he told me something that I'm never going to forget. We still have a lot to do. So he was celebrating his birthday and he said, we have a lot to do. And I said, yeah, you're right. Let's do it together. So together, we go further. So, yeah, we still have a lot to do, that's for sure. And Dr. Leonardo, representing the Ministry of the Economy, you're definitely surrounded by very capable people. People that have great ideas, that are committed, that struggle, that fight for the development in our country. And I think that's very important. We need to find the way. Of course, we have many difficulties, many hurdles along the way. If you ask me, what's the city, what's the state that's doing really well? No, everyone is having a hard time, especially financially speaking. But it's difficult, and sometimes we even work better in difficult times. So, Leonardo, I see that our new secretary is arriving. And so, guaranteeing that 100% of our experience would pass on to the new secretary. It doesn't make sense to do what we do here without conveying to other experiences. This is our main goal. And we're at your full disposal, the Ministry of the Economy, for the development of the ZPEs. Monica Luiz, thank you, Monica Luiz, for being a great moderator, very useful, and I really admire the work that you do. You play a very important role. And very important for the development of our state, of our region. So I hope that you continue doing the great work that you've been doing, all the success, and if you need anything from us, we're always available. Yeah, I'd like to invite Secretary of the ZPE for your final remarks. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity and for the support with this initiative. We know that we have many challenges. ZPE is just one of the challenges. We have many needs in our country to create jobs and income, private investment, the issue of the complex itself, very successful experience. Of course, we still have a lot to do, but we've had significant breakthroughs in terms of what's already been done, and that's really the idea. I mean, our mission here from the government is to help the country develop, to find ways of improving everything. ZPE is a project. Yeah, we know there's a lot to do. And I hope that we can have a legal framework that can help us more and more to develop. A project that always enchants everyone, amazes everyone. So if you don't have the opportunity yet, consider this project because it's worth getting to know and a great outlook for development, not only in the state of Ceará, but the country as a whole. So that's basically my take-home message. for everyone in Ceará Global. So we're at the end of our panel, and we had the opportunity to talk to our three guests about ZPEs in Brazil, especially talking about what are these export processing zones, their importance for regional development, and the future of ZPEs in Ceará and Brazil. If you have questions for our panel members, you can ask through the chat. If not answered here, they'll be sent to all of the contacts for the answers. We'll see you soon.